Our economy now is in such trouble. And by economy, I mean your jobs, your savings, your children's jobs, the money for pensions. That's what the economy is. It's human activity. But this economy is in such trouble that we cannot afford those old idiocies of the past, you know. When we had money, we thought, oh, we can afford them. No longer. And one of those idiocies is the idea that mass immigration is, of course, good for us. Of course, we can import 250,000 immigrants every year. Surely that just makes us richer. I mean, forget about the crowded roads and the trains and the traffic jams and the high price of housing and all these big infrastructure schemes we then got to fund in order to get rid of the congestion that these immigration policies cause in the first place. Forget about all that. Of course, this giant ponzi scheme just makes us better off. And let's bring in these hundreds of thousands of immigrants every single year until, I don't know what, until there's suburb after suburb, all the way from Melbourne to the Gold Coast. But interestingly, even a Labor frontbencher, even Kristina Keneally, now says it's time to cut the intake and, for a start, make sure jobs go to Australians first. Now, for saying something I thought was so sane, Australian jobs for Australians first, Keneally is being called a xenophobe and ignorant, being lectured to by columnists. Doesn't she know that mass immigration actually makes us richer? But does it? Joining me a short while ago was economist Judith Sloan, a former productivity commissioner and now columnist with the Australian newspaper. Judith Sloan, thank you so much for joining me. Does the net immigration that we've had for a few years, before this coronavirus crisis, of course, this net immigration of 240,000 people every year truly make us better off?
Okay, well, look, I think there are 2 points. First of all, of course, if you've got a bigger population, you have a bigger economy, right? So the actual GDP is larger, the larger the population. But what economists are interested in is per capita GDP, because that's the reflection of living standards, not the absolute size of the GDP. And what the economic analysis basically tells you is that, in fact, if there are any gains in per capita income, they're largely secured by the migrants themselves. So Australian residents are probably maybe as well off, possibly slightly less well off, because economists don't capture all the things that matter to people. But this idea that, and I see this even in the pages of my newspaper, that somehow this is a boon to productivity, a boon to economic growth, a boon to living standards, that's simply not borne out by the research.
And when you say the data doesn't capture all the things that matter to people, that would include the facts like, well, my city has just got a lot crowded. Well, I can't actually find a seat anymore on the train, or a spare place on the beach or something like that.
Well, absolutely. It's what we might, economists might call the external costs. So it might be loss of urban amenity, it might be congestion, it might be difficulty in, getting affordable housing, affordable rents. But by and large, the economic studies, they don't ever measure those external costs. They're only measuring the sort of direct effects. So, that matters a lot, I think, particularly because we know that those temporary migrants overwhelmingly come to Melbourne and Sydney, and to a slightly lesser degree to southeast Queensland.
What I don't understand is the objections to Kristina Keneally's opinion piece, where she says, listen, we need to have Australian jobs for Australians first. When in this crisis we've got more than 1 million people, 1 million people have lost their jobs, 3 to 5 million Australians are on sort of a welfare system to keep their jobs going from the federal government, and yet, we've even got the government during this crisis saying we're going to ease our restrictions on foreign workers so that we have foreign workers ready to pick fruit, etc., for farmers. I mean, shouldn't those be jobs that go to Australians first?
I mean, I didn't quite get the objection to what Kristina Keneally was saying, in the sense that it's actually more basic than that. the role of the government, federal and state and local government, is actually to look after the best interest, the well-being of the citizens, right? Now, it might take into account, global considerations and the like, but to say that they should be worried about the welfare, the well-being of the people who vote them in strikes me as absolutely uncontroversial. But you see, we'd got to a really funny point, I think, prior to COVID-19, which is there were a whole lot of people in decision-making positions who were sort of woke, green and globalist, right? And so they kind of never got this debate. But if you look at the surveys of ordinary people, they overwhelmingly have supported a cutback in migration for quite some time. And if you ask them their opinion, is the migration program too large? They overwhelmingly agree with that. It's just that the politicians, who I think are beholden to particular vested interests in this space, they just don't want to listen to what ordinary folks say.
I think that's probably right. Plus, they like their coffers being filled up and then prancing around in hard hats, and high-vis jackets at infrastructure sites that are necessary simply because the cities are too full, thanks to their own policies in the first place. Just quickly before we go, Judith, another idiocy that I don't think we can afford any more of in this, now that the economy's flat as a pancake. WESTPAC yesterday issued its global warming policy, claiming that climate change, it says, is one of the most significant issues that will impact on the long-term prosperity of the global economy and our way of life. Well, I think it comes nowhere to what the coronavirus has just done to us. And so WESTPAC says, yes, it will support existing thermal coal customers, that's coal-fired power stations and the like, but will commit to zero investments in coal by 2030. Is that the kind of policy we need from a major bank?
Well, I mean, it's extraordinary timing. But, watch this space, Andrew, that particularly in Europe, the debate has been, well, what is the post-COVID way forward? They're sort of talking new Green Deal. They're talking about, government subsidies for even more renewable energy and more green options. And I guess WESTPAC is just reflecting that locally. But it seems to me that in the post-COVID world, and particularly in view of our now acknowledged fragility in supply chains, we have to think about returning the Australia to having low, affordable and reliable energy, because that's the only way we're going to get a manufacturing sector back and running. So actually, I think, and I hope this happens, that a lot of this idiocy in this conversation will remember Andrew, about let's commit to net zero emissions by 2050. I think really that all looks so silly now, because we have to focus on the immediate future. And as you say, the real challenge is to get more Australians, the most Australians we can, back in work. And if that means Australians doing jobs that were previously undertaken by migrants and temporary migrants, that's not a bad thing.
I would have thought it's an extremely healthy thing. It beats having Australians sitting on the dole while bringing in more foreigners to do work that some people feel too precious for. But I just think that's a healthy thing. Judith Sloan, thank you so much indeed for your time.
It's a pleasure, Andrew.